The number that should have ended this conversation is 30,000. That is the conservative estimate of how many Iranian citizens were killed by their own security forces in just 48 hours on January 8th and 9th of 2026. Not over weeks, not spread across a month of escalating clashes. 48 hours. And yet, the regime that did this is not in its strongest position. It is in its most desperate one. Because the same institution that massacred its own population to preserve power is now running out of the money it needs to pay the people doing the killing. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the paramilitary empire that has functioned as the Islamic Republic's spine for 4 decades, is facing a financial reckoning so severe that its own soldiers have gone months without salaries. At some bases, desertion rates have reportedly reached 90%. The organization that put down the January uprising with live ammunition cannot reliably put soldiers on the street today because those soldiers cannot bring food home. What you are watching in Iran right now is not a regime under pressure. It is a regime in the final stages of structural decomposition, and the full scale of that collapse is far worse than anything being reported in Western headlines. To understand how Iran arrived here, you need to understand the architecture of the crisis, because this did not begin with the blockade. The blockade is the final act. The collapse has been building for years, accelerated by a series of decisions at every level of the Iranian state that turned manageable crises into cascading catastrophes. The story starts with the economy. Iran's currency had already lost more than 40% of its value against the dollar in the period following Israel's 12-day conflict in June 2025. Inflation, which had climbed above 48% by October 2025, was entrenching itself into the daily reality of every Iranian household, not as an abstract economic statistic, but as the lived experience of watching the price of cheese approach $5 in a country where the monthly minimum wage hovers around $130. The rial was not just losing value. It was losing its function as a medium of exchange. The economic contract between the Iranian state and its population, the implicit deal that said, endure the restrictions and we will provide a livable baseline, had already dissolved long before the first missile was fired. And then December 28th, 2025 arrived. What began in Tehran as an economic protest by merchants watching the currency collapse in real time became, within 5 days, the most serious internal challenge to the Islamic Republic since the 1979 revolution itself. The uprising spread to all 31 Iranian provinces simultaneously. Government buildings were stormed in western Iran. Security forces were chased out of Qom, the clerical heartland, the ideological capital of the theocracy, by crowds chanting slogans that would have been unthinkable years before. In Lordigan, in the Chahar Mahal and Bakhtiari province, heavy confrontations between citizens and security forces turned neighborhoods into battlegrounds. By January 8th, the regime had made its decision. The crackdown that followed was so concentrated and so lethal in so short a window that Amnesty International's researchers described it as unprecedented in the entire history of their documentation of Iranian repression, including the 2019 and 2022 protest waves, both of which were brutal. Between 30,000 and 36,500 people were killed in roughly 48 hours, according to reports from Time, The Guardian, and Iran International, citing local health officials. An internet blackout, imposed from January 8th onward and still in effect months later, was designed to conceal the scale of the violence from the outside world and to prevent protesters from coordinating. What it also concealed, unintentionally, was the evidence of the regime's own desperation. Because here is the thing about massacring 30,000 of your own citizens. It works, tactically, in the very short term. The protests were largely suppressed. The movement was broken apart, at least visibly, at least on the streets. The regime survived the January uprising in the immediate sense that it still controlled the instruments of state. But the strategic cost of that decision is only now becoming visible in full. A government that must kill 30,000 people to remain in power for another season has not demonstrated strength. It has demonstrated that consent is gone, that legitimacy is gone, and that the only remaining pillar holding the structure upright is the willingness of armed men to shoot civilians. And that pillar is now rotting, because those armed men are not being paid. The salary crisis inside Iran's security apparatus is not a rumor. It is documented, confirmed, and escalating. Iran International, which has built the most reliable ground-level reporting network on events inside Iran, obtained and reviewed internal notices confirming that members of Iran's police special units had their salary payments disrupted. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in recent months. The response from within those units was telling. In response to the third announced delay, personnel declined to show up to pro-government rallies. Deployments in major cities were affected. These are not soldiers refusing to fight on a distant front. These are the security forces whose specific job is to maintain regime control in the country's urban centers. When they stop showing up because they have not been paid, the geography of regime power begins to shrink in real time. Reports from the same period confirmed that retirees and regular Army personnel had not received salaries for 2 consecutive months. At one base, sources indicated that approximately 350 personnel had left their posts. In some units, the absence and desertion rate had reportedly approached 90%. This is not a morale problem. Morale problems can be addressed with ideology, with appeals to patriotism, with religious framing. What Iran is experiencing is a financial problem at the level of institutional survival. The IRGC built its coercive power on the ability to offer material benefits, salaries, housing allocations, business privileges, pension arrangements that made service worth the moral and social cost of enforcing the regime's will. That entire incentive structure depends on money flowing through the system. When the money stops, the structure does not soften. It cracks. And the cracks are now visible in real time through the desertion data, through the salary delay notices, through the Air Force pilots who are reportedly reluctant to fly combat missions after the documented loss of a Yak-130 aircraft, through the regular Army units operating on front lines with minimal supplies of ammunition and food and drinking water, with IRGC personnel, reportedly refusing to transport their wounded to hospitals despite medical facilities being available. That last detail is not incidental. It is the precise behavioral signature of an institution that has stopped functioning as a unified force and is operating instead as a collection of competing factions, each protecting its own resources. Now layer the U.S. blockade on top of this already crumbling foundation, and you begin to understand why the phrase 6 weeks keeps appearing in every serious analysis of Iran's situation. Since the U.S. naval blockade took effect, what was already a fragile economy has been forced toward a cliff edge at accelerating speed. The numbers are staggering. Iran was exporting approximately 71 million barrels per day of crude oil in April, according to ship tracking data from KPLR. The blockade has collapsed that figure to roughly 567,000 barrels per day, a reduction of nearly 75%. The financial consequence is immediate and arithmetic. A White House official told CNBC directly that Iran is losing $500 million per day as a result of the blockade. $500 million per day. In a country where the monthly minimum wage is $130, in a country where the government is already issuing $7 food coupons to keep the population at a subsistence level, in a country where the inflation rate has been confirmed by the International Monetary Fund at 68, 9% for 2026, with the economy expected to contract by 6%. 1% in the same year. The currency, already catastrophically weakened, has now fallen to approximately 32 million rials per US dollar. These are not numbers that describe an economy under stress. These are numbers that describe an economy in freefall. The mechanism of the coming crisis is hydraulic. Iran needs to keep its oil wells pumping to maintain underground pressure balances. Shutting down an oil well is not like closing a valve. When production halts, when the subterranean pressure structures that took decades to develop begin to deteriorate, restarting a well that has been shut in improperly requires massive technical remediation and billions of dollars in new investment that Iran cannot make when its foreign currency reserves are being consumed at $500 million per day. To avoid triggering this irreversible damage, Iran has been doing something that energy industry professionals recognize immediately as a distress signal. It has been using floating storage, pumping extracted crude oil directly into tankers anchored offshore, using those ships not as delivery vessels, but as temporary holding tanks for oil it cannot export and cannot afford to stop producing. The tankers sitting off Karg Island are not evidence of a regime managing the crisis. They are evidence of a regime buying time it cannot afford to spend. The mathematics of that floating storage capacity is the most important number in the Iran story right now. Analysis by Bloomberg and by Foreign Policy's Comprehensive Energy Desk, working from open source intelligence and satellite imagery, calculated that the combination of Iran's onshore and offshore storage capacity provides somewhere between 14 and 42 days of breathing room, 2 to 6 weeks. The IMF's contraction estimate of 6%, 1% for 2026, was calculated before the blockade intensified to its current severity. The Oxford Economics Assessment, published in April, projected that the blockade could cut 70% of Iran's export revenues, and that estimate was itself considered conservative by some analysts. More than 90% of Iran's annual trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. The closure of that corridor, combined with the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian port access, has effectively severed the country from the global economy. When the floating storage fills and the onshore tanks sound the alarm, the pumps will go silent, the oil wells will shut down, and the last financial artery keeping the Iranian state alive will be severed. What happens to a state when its primary revenue source disappears while it is simultaneously fighting an external conflict, suppressing internal dissent, sustaining a massive security bureaucracy, and watching the loyalty of that bureaucracy dissolve in real time, history provides an instructive template. The Soviet Union in 1991 did not collapse because NATO defeated it militarily. It collapsed because the financial mechanisms holding the loyalty structure of the nomenklatura together failed. The day Soviet officials calculated that the system could no longer deliver what it had promised them, the institutional commitment to the system evaporated. The Gaddafi regime in Libya went through a structurally similar process. The Assad regime in Syria demonstrated the same pattern. Financial stress translating into security force fracturing, translating into territorial loss, translating into collapse. In each case, the regime that looked monolithic from the outside was, in reality, a coalition of interests held together by financial flows. When those flows stopped, the coalition dissolved. Iran is at an earlier stage of that same process, but the trajectory is unmistakable to anyone who has studied how states actually collapse as distinct from how they appear to collapse. The internal power structure that Iran presents to the outside world as a coherent government is, on closer inspection, something far more fractured and far more dangerous than a simple authoritarian state. What has emerged from the documented reporting of April and May 2026 is a picture of a system in which no single authority is actually in control, and in which the entity that has seized the most formal power, the IRGC, is the one most structurally incapable of managing the crisis it now owns. Consider the specific architecture of the current power vacuum. Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, who was rushed into the position following the death of his father in the February 2026 U.S.-Israeli airstrikes, is a figure who derives his position from political maneuvering rather than from the broad clerical standing that the Constitution technically requires for the office. He lacks the religious authority that gave his father institutional legitimacy across the clerical establishment. And he is currently, according to multiple independent reports, effectively unreachable. IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi and a small circle of senior guard officials have erected what sources describe as a security cordon around Khamenei, blocking access, intercepting official government correspondence intended for the Supreme Leader, and preventing direct contact between the Supreme Leader and the elected president. President Masoud Pezeshkian, who won election in 2025 on a platform of moderation and reform, has reportedly requested urgent meetings with Khamenei on multiple occasions. Every request has gone unanswered. His attempts to appoint critical cabinet ministers, including an intelligence minister, following the Israeli assassination of his predecessor, have been blocked. Every candidate Pezeshkian proposed was reportedly rejected by Vahidi on the grounds that wartime conditions require sensitive positions to remain under direct military oversight. The administration of an elected president is in what Iran International describes as a state of complete political deadlock. What Vahidi and the IRGC have effectively done is seize control of the Iranian state apparatus. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the same figure who led Iran's first round of negotiations with the United States in Islamabad and was identified by Trump himself as Washington's potential interlocutor on a diplomatic channel, cannot make decisions without IRGC approval. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi faces the same constraint. The civilian government of Iran exists as a formal legal structure. It does not exist as a functioning decision-making entity. Vahidi stated openly that, under wartime conditions, all critical positions must be chosen and managed directly by the Revolutionary Guards. This is where the paradox at the center of the Iranian crisis becomes most visible. The IRGC has seized the state, but the IRGC is an organization whose entire institutional logic was built around perpetual conflict. The IRGC's economic empire, its construction conglomerates, its telecommunications networks, its petrochemical facilities, its banking interests, was built and sustained during periods of sanctions and tension because conflict justified the organization's centrality. Every time Iran was under external pressure, the IRGC expanded its economic footprint by crowding out civilian competitors under the justification of national security. The hardliners within the organization understand this dynamic at a visceral level. Peace does not just mean diplomatic concessions. Peace means competitive markets. Peace means civilian oversight. Peace means the IRGC's business empire getting questioned, audited, potentially dismantled. War, paradoxically, is better for the IRGC institutionally than any peace deal could be, even a war that is destroying the country it controls. This is the structural reason why the foreign minister's directive in April to open the Strait of Hormuz to civilian ship traffic was sabotaged within hours by the IRGC Navy, which conducted attacks on vessels in the region on the same day. The civilian government was attempting to create a diplomatic off-ramp. The IRGC military wing torpedoed it, not simply as a tactical decision, but as an institutional reflex. For the pragmatist faction of the IRGC, including those who have spent years moving the organization's wealth into safe havens abroad, the calculation is shifting. The system is approaching bankruptcy. The question for these figures is no longer whether the system survives. but whether they can position themselves advantageously before the collapse becomes total. The possibility of a palace coup, internal purges, or a split within the IRGC between the ideologically rigid faction and the pragmatically self-interested faction is no longer a theoretical scenario discussed in think tank papers. It is a live operational question being gamed out in the intelligence services of every major government with interests in the region. The Trump administration's strategy in this environment is one of deliberate, patient financial strangulation. Washington has made a calculated decision not to spend billions of dollars in precision munitions striking Iranian infrastructure, not primarily because of the risk calculus, but because it does not need to. The blockade is accomplishing what missiles would accomplish, without giving Iran the external attack narrative it has historically used to consolidate domestic support around the regime during moments of internal fragility. Every time Iran has faced a genuine internal challenge, the regime's most reliable tool has been the invocation of foreign aggression. The enemy at the gates, the nation under attack, the call to unity against external threat. The blockade denies that narrative its most powerful element. It is not a military assault, it is a financial embargo. It is time and mathematics, not fire and explosions, and it is working with a precision that no airstrike campaign could match, because it is striking the salary of every soldier and the food budget of every civil servant simultaneously. The global costs are real, and the Trump administration is bearing them consciously. U.S. gasoline prices have climbed sharply as the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed. The International Energy Agency characterized the current oil supply disruption as the largest in the history of the global market. Global fertilizer prices have spiked dramatically, threatening agricultural supply chains in developing economies. The financial market impact has been severe. Brent crude tested $100 per barrel in the initial stages of the crisis and has remained elevated. But the Washington calculation is that weathering these economic fluctuations is strategically cheaper than the alternative. Either a military campaign that would cost hundreds of billions of dollars and potentially trigger a broader regional war, or a negotiated settlement that leaves Iran's fundamental capacities intact. The blockade is Washington's version of the same patience that Ukraine employed at Kupiansk, waiting for the enemy's system to destroy itself from within, rather than expending resources destroying it from without. Tehran's diplomatic thrashing in this environment has the quality of a drowning man reaching for anything solid. The regime has been conveying updated ceasefire proposals through Pakistan as an intermediary, attempting to find a diplomatic channel that bypasses the U.S.'s stated preconditions. These proposals have created brief fluctuations in global energy markets. They have not created any change in Washington's fundamental posture. The White House is not conducting a classic negotiation in which both sides move toward a mutually acceptable middle ground. It is presenting conditions and waiting for Iran to accept or collapse. That is a qualitatively different kind of diplomacy. It is diplomacy as attrition. Meanwhile, back inside Tehran, in the markets where workers line up for $7 food coupons, in the hospitals overwhelmed by the cascading health consequences of economic collapse, in the barracks where soldiers debate whether the regime they serve is worth a salary it cannot deliver, the pressure is building towards something that has not yet fully announced itself, but whose shape is becoming legible to anyone paying close attention. The January 2026 protests were suppressed through the most violent crackdown in the history of the Islamic Republic. But the conditions that produced those protests, the inflation, the unemployment, the currency collapse, the daily indignity of an economy being run into the ground by ideological rigidity and institutional corruption, have not just persisted. They have dramatically worsened. The blockade has added $500 million per day in financial bleeding to an economy that was already hemorrhaging. The food coupons are worth $7 per person in a country where cheese costs $5 for a single block. 2 million people have lost their jobs. Urban poverty across Tehran, Mashhad, Avaz, and Karaj has reached a stage where analysts describe it as a complete collapse of the social contract, not an income gap, but a structural dissolution of the entire system of housing, employment, and social identity for large portions of the population. The question analysts are debating is not whether another protest wave comes. The conditions for protest are objectively worse now than they were in December 2025. The question is what form the next eruption takes, and whether the security apparatus that suppressed the last one retains the capacity, financial, organizational, motivational, to suppress the next. Every documented indicator points in the same direction. Salary delays affecting the third consecutive payment cycle in police special units. Desertion rates approaching 90% in some units. Air Force pilots declining combat missions. Regular Army units running out of food and water on active deployments. IRGC refusing to transport the wounded of the regular Army. An elected president who cannot get a meeting with the supreme leader. A supreme leader surrounded by a military cordon that filters his information and controls his access. A negotiation team that cannot negotiate because the IRGC will torpedo any agreement it does not control. And floating offshore storage tanks that are filling up toward capacity, while the clock on Iran's financial system runs down toward zero. Before we arrive at that conclusion, there is a dimension of this crisis that is almost entirely absent from mainstream analysis, but which carries the most severe long-term consequences for global security. That is the nuclear dimension. And within the specific context of IRGC dominance over all Iranian decision-making, the nuclear file has moved from being a diplomatic bargaining chip to being an institutional survival tool. Under the civilian leadership of Pezeshkian, there was at least a theoretical pathway to a negotiated nuclear arrangement, some form of constraint on enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. Pezeshkian was elected specifically on the platform of pursuing that pathway. That pathway is now closed, not because the United States refused to walk it, but because the IRGC blocked the door from the Iranian side. Vahidi and the hardline commanders who currently control Tehran's decision-making have a structural interest in maintaining nuclear ambiguity, because nuclear ambiguity is the one card the IRGC retains that no external actor can simply blockade away. A nuclear threshold capability is, from the IRGC's institutional perspective, the ultimate insurance policy against the kind of regime change scenario that American and Israeli strategic planners discuss openly. The logic is straightforward. No government considers a ground invasion of a nuclear threshold state. The nuclear program is not just a deterrent against external military action. For the IRGC, it is a deterrent against the kind of total pressure campaign that might otherwise force a negotiated surrender. This means that as the financial pressure intensifies, as the protest conditions worsen, as the security apparatus fragments further, the IRGC's incentive to accelerate enrichment, to reach the threshold before the economic collapse forces a decision, actually increases. This is the most dangerous possible combination of circumstances in nuclear security analysis. A financially desperate, internally fragmented, externally blockaded regime controlled by a paramilitary organization whose institutional survival depends on maintaining the threat of nuclear capability, operating without functional civilian oversight, with a supreme leader who cannot be reached. The red lines that civilian negotiators like IRGC had the flexibility to draw and then adjust are gone. The lines are now drawn by commanders who have publicly stated that war is preferable to any deal that questions their authority. This creates a genuine escalation risk that the blockade strategy, for all its tactical brilliance, does not fully account for. Russia and China are watching the situation with interests that are more complex and more self-serving than the framing of Iran's allies suggests. For Moscow, Iran's IRGC-dominated wartime state was, in many respects, a preferred interlocutor, precisely because military institutions are more ideologically rigid and more transactional than civilian governments. The Kremlin has spent decades building relationships with institutions that deal in weapons, energy, and strategic leverage, and the IRGC fits that template better than a reformist civilian government would. But the same ideological rigidity that makes the IRGC a predictable partner in certain transactions also makes it a liability in crisis management. Russia cannot want a total Iranian state collapse that creates a power vacuum on a border adjacent to the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Caspian energy infrastructure. Beijing's calculus is similar. China had been receiving Iranian oil at heavily discounted rates, a critical strategic benefit from the relationship, and a collapsed Iran produces nothing for anyone. Both Russia and China will attempt to use their economic relationships with Tehran as leverage for influence in whatever post-crisis arrangement emerges. Neither has the capability or the apparent will to actually rescue the Islamic Republic from the financial physics that currently govern its trajectory. They are strategic spectators, calculating which arrangement of the wreckage best serves their interests. There's a term in structural engineering called progressive collapse. It describes what happens when one element of a load-bearing system fails, transferring its load to adjacent elements, which then fail in sequence, each failure accelerating the next until the entire structure comes down, not from a single catastrophic blow, but from the cumulative failure of components that were already operating beyond their design limits. What is happening in Iran right now has the precise signature of progressive collapse. The economic component is failing, transferring load to the financial system. The financial system is failing, transferring load to the security apparatus. The security apparatus is fracturing, transferring load to the IRGC. The IRGC is seizing total power at the moment it is least capable of exercising it, because holding power when the treasury is empty means owning every political and social consequence of the bankruptcy alone. The civilian government that might have negotiated a way out has been stripped of the authority to do so. The supreme leader who might have adjudicated between the factions cannot be reached. The soldiers who might have suppressed the next uprising have not been paid in months. The oil storage tanks are filling up. The clock is running. The regime that massacred 30,000 people in 48 hours to buy itself another season is discovering that seasons have a price. And the price of the next season is one it can no longer afford to pay. So here's the question this situation ultimately demands of every analyst, every policymaker, and every person watching from outside the walls of this crisis. When an institution seizes total power, specifically to prevent the compromises that would allow it to survive, when the IRGC takes the wheel of a state, it is simultaneously bankrupting by refusing to negotiate. When it fires on its own population and then cannot pay the soldiers who fired, at what exact moment does the internal calculation inside that institution shift from we are protecting the system to we are protecting ourselves from the system? Because that is the question the next few weeks will answer. And when it does, nothing in the Middle East will look the same again.